Hey there, boils and ghouls. Welcome to another episode of Halloweekly, where this week George interviews John Langan. He is the author of the 2016 Bram Stoker Award-winning novel The Fisherman, the collection The Wide Carnivorous Sky, and other works. He has been a finalist for the International Horror Guild Award and is also on the board of directors for the Shirley Jackson Awards. So take a listen and enjoy.
First of all, The Fisherman won the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a Novel. Congratulations.
Astonishingly, yes. Thank you.
Well-deserved win. But how did it feel to win it?
I nearly fell out of my chair. Of course, I've been nominated for a couple of other awards in the past. And of course, you always say it doesn't matter, or you say, oh, the honor is just in being nominated. And it is true that the honor is in being nominated. And it's also true that what matters most is that people are reading your book. Having said that, of course, you're watching, and the Stoker ballot this year was remarkably strong. There was, all the novels that my book was nominated alongside were just so good that I couldn't have complained if any of the others had won. Sometimes you're up for an award and you think, well, I hope I don't lose to that guy, but no, this any of those people, Stephen Graham Jones's Mongrels,
amazing
was
book.
Just such an incredible book, and Paul Tremblay's Disappearance at Devil's Rock. I thought was an even more powerful book than Head Full of Ghosts. Although that may be because it really got me in the sort of parental feels, as the kids say.
Sure.
Bracken McLeod, Stranded was a wonderful sort of throwback to the Thing. And also the sort of polar, trapped in the ice thing, which of course is the Thing, but it's something that you find in horror fiction, right? Going all the way back to Frankenstein, at least. And then of course, Liz Hand is just such a beautiful writer, and her Cass Neary books are just incredible. So I could not, how can you complain losing to any of those? And to win was just amazing, especially since I was watching the video feed and it cut out right as George R.R. Martin was starting to announce the best first novel, and I'm running around the house, and it, fortunately for me, it cut back in just as he read my. I was sort of seated in time to fall out of my chair as he read my name. So
I was going to ask you how you found out, and it sounds like greater forces were trying to make it suspenseful for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I of course, that I couldn't get to sleep. I was like, I'll just stay up and watch this, and then I'll go to bed. No big deal. And then, of course, I was wide awake, and fortunately, my Laird Barron, who's a good friend of mine, called me to congratulate me. So that gave me a chance to sort of, release some of that nervous or excited energy for a little while.
That's awesome. Laird Barron seems like someone that would be interesting. His response, I would imagine it would be complex. But you guys are good friends, so
yeah. No, we've been good friends. We published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I'm trying to think about this. I published, I think, my first story in FNSF came out in August of 2001. His came out in September of 2001. And Gordon Van Gelder, who was the editor at the time, emailed me and he said, you like this horror stuff. You should check this guy out because what he's doing is really weird. And he was right, and I read it. And so, Laird and I sort of became aware of each other, and we started off emailing each other, and it was this terribly formal, almost sort of 19th century correspondence. Dear Mr. Barron, I hope this missive finds you well. And we just hit it off. And the first time we met, I felt like, oh, this is the other brother I didn't know I had. We've just always been good friends. And he when he moved east, he stayed with my family and I for a while. And even now he's about a 10-minute, 15-minute ride away from me. So we talk a few times a week and just, kick stuff around, gossip, story ideas, news, that sort of thing.
That's awesome. I actually was going to ask you this later because I just reread The Fisherman and I'm so excited to talk about it. I was heading straight forward, but this is something I wanted to know. I feel like there was a couple periods in like my experience of reading horror where when I did some research behind it and found interviews and all that stuff, I thought that there seemed to be a camaraderie among a whole set of horror authors, kind of like the Ramsey Campbell, Stroud, King era. And the other ones. And I feel like I'm sensing the same thing around a cluster of writers now. And is that sense accurate? And can you talk about a little the kind of camaraderie in the group of horror authors that are current?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I should note that like when I was younger, in my 20s and I was and even my late teens, and I was writing and I had decided I was going to try to write sort of literary fiction as opposed to this genre stuff. I went to see a lot of writers give readings up at SUNY Albany, about an hour north from where I live now and from where I was going to school at the time at SUNY New Paltz. There's a New York State Writers Institute, and they bring about a dozen, sometimes more, different writers to their campus every semester. And it's a variety of writers. It's people like Salman Rushdie and also people who you haven't heard of because they're up and coming. So I saw a lot of these writers, and especially with the guys, man, they were jerks. These brilliant writers, on the page, but then you'd meet them in person and they were just total, total jerks. That's the
sure.
The polite way to put it, I guess. And there was definitely the sense that, everybody was in competition with everybody else and there wasn't enough oxygen in the room for all of us. So get out of my way. Mm-hmm. And then when I started writing horror and publishing horror, the first couple of conventions I went to, the first ReaderCon I went to in 2003, people were so gracious. They were so nice. The fact that I had only published a couple of stories in FNSF, they were like, that's fine, that's great. Let's talk. And that was amazing. And I really loved that. I really loved it. It probably helped, I think, just sort of thinking about it in retrospect. When you're the horror writers at a convention that has a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers, you sort of group together. Here we are. We're in this together. We're even the
you're putting Silo over there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, even the science fiction and fantasy writers, like, oh, at least we're not the horror writers. Even they look down on us. Wow. And that's not fair. That's not fair. A lot of them were very, very sweet. But I think what happened was around that time in the early aughts, I guess we call it. I just sort of, in part because of ReaderCon and just sort of social gatherings, I became friendly with people like Paul Tremblay, like Michael Sisko, like Sarah Langan, who's she must be a relation somehow, but she's no immediate relation. And we just sort of we formed this kind of loose friendship that was really just based on the fact that we all loved, we were all writing in the horror genre, but broadly defined. And we all, I think, kind of responded to each other's ambition. We had, in a lot of cases, we'd grown up reading the same stuff. And so there was that. But it was also, we'd also read a lot of different things too. And we brought, these really different perspectives to what we were doing. I think, we became quite, all of us actually became quite good friends. But, never in we never kind of got our act together enough to like publish a manifesto or something and say, what I think you've seen in the last several years, 4 or 5 years, maybe even 6 years, is you've seen a group of writers who are newer writers than we are or than we were. People like Scott Nicolay, Mike Griffin, Anya Martin, Espen Mitkowski, Christy DeMeester, Michael Wehunt, and they've gathered together in I think a somewhat more coherent way than we did. With us, I think it was more of a loose sense of, hey, we're all doing this kind of stuff together, and isn't that cool? And we admire each other's work, and we play little games, like, we sort of steal things from each other's work and incorporate it in our work. And whereas I think with what the I guess they're calling themselves the weird Renaissance writers. And I think what they're doing is something that's a little bit more thought out and a little bit more. If I say programmatic, I don't mean it as in any way a criticism so much as just a description. That I think they have an idea that they want to do. They have certain things that they want to do, and that they want to do as a kind of as a group, I guess, or as like a movement, I guess. And I think I'm probably making this sound, I suspect it's not even quite as well organized as I'm making it sound. They did have a symposium down in Atlanta a couple months ago. And I think there's this, they go along with what seems to me this attempt to rebrand a lot of horror fiction as weird fiction. And to say, and I know that I have dear friends who believe firmly that there is such a thing as weird fiction, and I love them. And I hope they get the help they need. No, pardon me.
No, fine.
No, but I think that it's they see themselves as doing something distinctive, well,
I think it's natural for people who are, with the dominance of social media now, they form movements. It's more of a reflex than before, and it's easier to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we all started, when Paul and Sarah and Laird and I all started writing, there was LiveJournal was still a thing. That was the big thing. Was you went message boards were still a big thing, and that was what that was your social media. Facebook obviously has changed things as has Twitter. They've changed things dramatically. So I think what's been kind of interesting to me in the last few years is that Paul, Laird, myself, Sarah, we've been I don't know, coming into contact more with writers who are approximately the same age we are. Let's say people like Chris Golden.
Sure.
Or Brian Keene, or Mary San Giovanni, but we sort of moved in different social circles, and then also social media circles, and yet there are lots of ways in which I look at the work that Chris is doing, or Brian's doing, Mary's doing, and I think that we have a lot in common. Actually, that there are a lot of ways that our work or you look at someone like Gary Bronbeck or Tim Levin. I think there are lots of interesting parallels. We all came out of similar environments in terms of thinking about the predominance of Stephen King and Peter Straub, the predominance of the Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone, and the first reboot, I guess it was. We grew up in the 80s, more or less children of nuclear anxiety and what have you. So I think that there are lots of things that actually tie us together in interesting kinds of ways. And that's kind of neat. It's neat to have that, to be able to continue to make those connections.
That's awesome, because that's how I felt it was from outside. It's gratifying to know that that there's all these kind of connections happening and mutual support. Because even like with podcasting, I found I kind of naively went into, like, everyone who podcasts on a certain theme will probably just be great friends, but there's a lot of competition, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and there's that, right? It's that notion that you can't have your show and if someone else is going to have their show, right? And which is silly,
Exactly. I mean, we actually,
why can't
the antithesis of that is our ethics. So like that's, it's good to find that the thing that we're focused on I think horror lends itself to that, honestly. And I suspect it was so. I got to dive into The Fisherman because I'm so excited.
Sure.
I had so much fun reading this book.
Thank you.
And I had a kind of fun while I was reading it that I felt like I've had fun like this before reading a novel, and I could not place it for days. And then finally it came to me. It was a book called The Ceremonies by Ted
Klein. Sure.
Absolutely. And I got so struck by the fact that it was like, I'm enjoying this in a certain way. It's not that they're similar books. It's just that it was the same kind of enjoyment. And I don't know why.
Sure.
But I know that he based that book off a novella originally, and then expanded it. And I noticed your writing, you write pretty lengthy, even when it's short story, novella length. And this book is kind of a nested story within a story. So it made me wonder how you decided how to structure it like that. And if it always was structured like that, or it morphed at the time.
It always was structured like that. Having said that, the nested narrative was never supposed to be a novel within a novel or a novella within a novella. It was. I thought it would be like maybe 40 pages or something like that.
Yeah.
I didn't think it would be half of the book, but and at certain points I tried. I thought, I should try to rein this in, but actually, Laird had gotten advice from Jeffrey Ford, who's another great writer, and it was when Laird was working on his first full-length novel. He'd written a short novel called "The Light Is the Darkness." He was working on The Croning, and he was, I think, emailing Ford. It might have been in phone conversation, but anyway, Ford said to him, "It's your first novel. You're going to be really tempted to play it safe. You're going to be really tempted to dial it down and back because it's my first novel. I want to make a good impression. I'm meeting the parents for dinner. I want to make sure I don't wear my Iron Maiden t-shirt or whatever,
Sure.
And Ford said, fight that impulse. Go big, go wild, go widescreen.
That's great.
And so when which Laird did in The Croning and to good effect. And so I thought the same thing with when I got to the middle section of The Fisherman, the historical narrative, there was a part of me that thought that I should kind of dial it back. I should take it to a certain point in creepiness, but then I should just have the sort of band of heroes, if you will, just kind of like go away, like they just disappear and you don't know what happens, and then they come back and they're like, okay, it's cool, it's done. And then when I remembered Ford's advice, I just thought, nope, the heck with that. Just go big or go home. It's if everybody screams with laughter, that's fine. At least you can't be. You can't be accused of not having tried.
Well, that's a good piece of advice that seems to be serving multiple people. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Credit for that. There's a line that I love that was about a quarter way into the book that really struck me, where I think it's basically the line is, now that curiosity has been mixed together with unease, I wouldn't go so far as to say folks are afraid of Cornelius Guest as that they're ready to be. Right. And the thing that struck me about this line was at exactly that point in the novel, I was ready to be scared. So it was placed, and I was experiencing as a reader exactly that. Like I wasn't scared yet.
Right.
But I had been primed to be, right? So this concept fascinates me. I know horror writers talk about how you write a scary scene or whatever, but you're laying groundwork in advance to get people ready to be scared. Right. Do you think you're like that consciously, or is it just organic the way the story goes?
Well, that line was that's a lucky line that it happens, because I think I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And then, part of me wants to say, yes, of course, but how smart of you, to see how smart I am. No, that line that's fortuitously placed. But in terms of my overall kind of narrative strategy, I tend to think about it almost musically, that you need you need a certain number of beats, as it were. You need your story needs a certain kind of a rhythm before you reach the horrific event. You can have a little teaser at the beginning. You can have a little something that makes people say, "Oh, that the hook," as it were.
Yeah,
right?
you actually gave away a lot of what was going to transpire, but did it really brief right in the beginning. Where basically Abe is saying, this and this and what we saw and what we even touched, Lord help us, and then you just walked away from it, and then later. So I mean, I see that you were teasing it.
And it's being able then to wait, and to say no, this needs to come. It's it's music or it's architecture. No, wait, we need to get to this point. We need to build the house to this point before we put the arch in or the door or whatever.
That's interesting. So you're seeing it more in terms of beats and placement than specific. That's interesting. Oh.
Yeah. Well, it's that feeling that you have, that it was one of the things that I always admired about Stephen King when I was a kid. And then I admired, I read a lot of comic books too, and the best comic book writers. I was reading comics in the 70s, so it was people like, especially Marv Wolfman and Len Wein did a lot of stuff together. And their stuff was so brilliantly paced. It kept you turning the pages. It was giving you enough to keep you going. There were little revelations hither, thither, and yon. And so, yeah, that style of storytelling really, I think when all is said and done, it really resonates with me in a way. There are other ways to write a horror story, and I'm trying. I guess at this point, I'm thinking more in my short fiction about experimenting with this. Well, what if you did other things? What if you structured a story in a different way so that the beats are off, or it's there's no beat, or
sure.
But what can you get away with? But I think that especially with longer stuff, I feel like pacing is so very, very important, and it doesn't, even if it's fast paced, even if you have a story where you're trying to move through there's lots of action and the characters are hurtling ahead. I still feel like there has to be a certain rhythm to what's going on, so that it doesn't feel that, oh, wait, this is all happening, wrong. And that kind of, it's like editing in a movie or something like that.
Sure.
You're like, why is that scene shot that, I want to try to, I think that, like, again, I go back to King or Peter Straub for that matter, and novels like The Shining or Salem's Lot or Ghost Story. Man, those things are so masterfully paced. They're so masterfully cut and edited and arranged. And I guess that's the model to which I aspire.
That's awesome, because you're right with those books and with yours. Honestly, I felt like there was an inevitability when I turned the page of I almost knew what was coming, but I didn't. Right.
But
that's because there's an architecture. You can tell that there's a structure to it. The Fisherman has a lot of call outs to literature, obviously in Moby Dick.
Yeah.
I think I spotted a Sheridan Le Fanu reference in there. What other books that are already written is your book, The Fisherman, conducting a dialogue with?
Well, yeah, obviously Moby Dick. When I started writing, when I came back to writing horror stories, I had this idea that the stories I was going to write were going to be in dialogue with different literary works that had come before them. So my first couple of published stories were in dialogue with a couple of Henry James stories, mm-hmm. and then I had a story that was kind of in dialogue with Stephen King, I guess, and another story that was in dialogue with a short novel by Saul Bellow called Seize the Day. Mm-hmm. So when I came to write the Fisherman, I was thinking, I'm going to write a short story or maybe a slightly longer story that's in dialogue with Moby Dick, and then boom, the whole thing just exploded. So Moby Dick remained there in really important ways as until the end of the novel. When Stephen King was writing Salem's Lot, he talked about playing a game of handball with Dracula. That his novel was like mm-hmm. this ball that he was bouncing off Dracula, and it was coming back to him with at an angle. His narrative is coming back at an angle, and so in some ways, that's how I thought about the Fisherman with Moby Dick. There were moments where I wanted to take it even further. The further you go in Moby Dick, as they're sailing around trying to find the whale, they run into all these different ships that have had their own encounters with Moby Dick, and some are good and some are bad. And I had that in mind at one point. It'd be really cool if I could blow this thing up even more and have like all these different people talking about their different encounters with the Fisherman. But it seemed at that point that it was going to compromise the focus of the book to such an extent. I was already asking people with the middle section of the book. I was already asking them to give me a lot of rope to hang myself with, I suppose, in terms of these guys having heard this story that then kind of it's like a zip file that unfolds in their minds afterwards, so that they know even more than what they heard in this little diner. So I didn't want to do that. But to get back to your question, I think somebody pointed out to me, it was an early interview I did for the Fisherman. They said, well, obviously your book is a cross between Moby Dick and Pet Sematary. And I swear to God, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I was so shocked because I was like, of course it is. Of course it's about Pet Sematary. It never once while I was writing it was that consciously in my thoughts. But when I looked at the book, then I thought, of course and that's one of King's books that I read and reread over and over again, because it's such an extreme book. It's a book where he really pushes things, I think, in terms of his concern with family relations and the relationship between parents and children in danger. He really pushes it, I think, just about as far as you can. So, and the book just made a huge impression on me. I've taught the book. So to be told the book was in there by somebody else, it was one of those things that often happens to me where I'm just like, oh my God, you're absolutely right. My wife got me a card a few years ago for our anniversary. And it was a picture of a guy holding open a refrigerator, and the refrigerator's full of stacks of butter. And he's shouting to his wife, honey, where's the butter? And I often feel like that with, people will point something out to me and I'll think, of course it's Pet Sematary.
That's so interesting that it's unconscious that you're not aware of it, though. And it's fascinating to me because, Pet Sematary was partially a dialogue with the monkey's paw, right? So you got
yeah.
It's so interesting that you have like this kind of chain of events where people are influencing each other. I think that's sort of like Harold Bloom's theory, right? Like you kind of struggle with the people created before you, try to find your own voice, and et cetera. That's the thing is I got the Pet Sematary part, but it was really fascinating to me that you were like, because Moby Dick seems like there's a line someone famous called War and Peace, a baggy monster.
Yeah, Henry James called those. It was called those like War and Peace and Dickens novels, loose, baggy monsters. These books, these capacious books that just seem to have everything in them, but also they didn't have the kind of crisper form that he was looking for in a novel. And
Sure.
You're right, a lot of horror novels, especially since the 70s on, a lot of famous horror novels have that same feel, whether it's The Stand or Floating Dragon or The Throat or Robert McCammon's Swan Song. Yeah. You just have these great big sprawling books, and I love that.
One of my favorites is Carry Comfort. It just made me think of, absolutely.
Yeah. Dan Simmons has done that because he Carry Comfort, but also what was it, Summer of Night too, right? Another big sprawling kind of horror novel.
But yours is really focused, and the interesting thing is, for all the Lovecraftian things that get thrown around or whatever, I was actually really amazed when it was done with the book how thoroughly I felt like things had been explained and shown. Like, I feel like I know what the Fisherman is. I feel like I know what the people went through. It was, there's less, somehow it was like a magic trick. Like, you were doing things where you were talking about like a really murky universe and black ocean, like whatever. But when it was all over, I felt like everything had been explained, which is it's a weird effect, right? Because that's how a fisherman would tell a story. Like when it was over, you'd be like, yeah, I know everything that happened. Right.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, and especially King used to do it. But Clive Barker was really great at doing this kind of technique in things, and some of the stories, some of the novellas, and some of the novels too. Things like Weave World, where he would have a couple of phrases, a couple of sentences, and somehow he was just able to conjure up this image of this whole world that stood behind the hints that he was giving you. And I love that. I absolutely loved that when I was a kid, because I felt like it gave me room for my imagination to fill in some of those blanks anyway. It really, it got me, it really got me involved. And so I was shooting for something like that. I think, whether I succeeded or not, I'm still not sure, but I think that technique where you can suggest something that brings the reader in and then invites the reader to put the pieces together and to create or to help to create a kind of a full picture of the universe. I think if you can do that, you get a reader who's much more involved in what you're doing, and that's obviously that's what you want.
That's awesome. I got to tell you, I at the end of this book, no spoilers, but Abe says a line that really struck me, where he's talking about his wife, and he says to Dan, he says, "I prefer to meet up with her in my own time." And I thought it was one of the bravest things I've heard, and saddest things I've heard a character in a horror novel say in quite a while. And it was incredibly sensible. So I know that in horror movies, like, the constant complaint of horror fans or critics is that the characters all make dumb decisions. They're basically just there to be fed to their fates, so to speak.
Right.
Do horror novelists also have to contend with the characters making bad decisions that put them in necessary places trap? Is that something you have to think through, or no?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I mean, for me, when I came back to writing horror in my my late 20s and my early 30s, part of the reason that I wrote such long stories to start with was because I had a really hard time with short horror stories, because so many short horror stories were like those movies where the characters are just there to be killed. They're just meat to be murdered. They're there to make horrible decisions. And I just thought that's not really interesting. That's not the Saw movies or whatever. They just don't really do that much for me. And no harm to you if you love them, but I just there was no drama of character for me in those things. And so that's what I loved about longer stories, about novelettes, novellas, and then about the novel was it gave you a chance to really think about character and think about motivations, so that if your character is going to do something that you as the reader, or that the reader will recognize is a dumb move, that the reader will understand that dumb move. So yeah, Dan in the novel does some less than advisable things. But what I hope is that you understand the sheer grief that's and desperation that's driven him to do these less than advisable things. Sure. So that you may still say to yourself, I would never do that, and that's totally fine, but at least you don't think, what an idiot. You think, oh man, yeah, that was bad. That guy was in a really bad way to do this.
Well, and to your point about length, I think, in horror movies, it's chronically a split-second decision, whereas Dan's decisions, I mean, he's actually deceptive, right? And he's thinking through. So his actions are, I mean, there's just a remarkable amount of effort in the villainy that takes place in this novel. Like the villains are really working hard. Like I almost had, I did actually have sympathy for just the level of effort it took. So, I don't think you could charge him with making a dumb decision, because it's so thought through and it's so connected to why he's doing it, right? That's the thing, is that there's, because of the length, he's not suddenly making this decision. Like, this is literally over months and months or even years.
Yeah, I wanted to have, honestly, I wanted to have a number of characters as the novel went on. I wanted to have a number of characters who made a similar kind of a decision, going all the way back ultimately to the fisherman himself, that in the pursuit of what he's lost and trying to get that back. As someone said, who was it? Robert Penn Warren or someone was talking about a literary character, and he said, his means defile his ends. And that was I kind of liked that idea that that as is the case of Ahab, I mean his in Melville, right? I mean,
Sure.
his leg has been taken. It's sort of understandable. He's mad at this whale and he wants to kill it, but ultimately that leads him to madness and destruction. And I think that's really fascinating. I think those characters, in whom we can kind of at least imagine ourselves, if not see ourselves directly, but we can at least say, oh yeah, I guess if I were pushed in certain ways, I would make similar bad calls.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things I've noticed, so we live in an age of like anxiety now, right? One of the weird, like common jokes I've been hearing on every news network is, or even not just news networks, but even shows like Colbert or Samantha Bee or whatever. It's like they've all struck on the same joke, which is, it's day 10,000 of the Trump administration. and the idea is that it feels that way, right? That it's like whatever. So I've found this book strangely soothing. I wanted to ask you if you feel like there's a place. Does horror as a genre, does its place or the craft of it change in an age where people's nerves are rubbed so raw, or is it just kind of flow on like it always does?
It's an interesting question. I mean, horror was, of course, was really big in the 50s. And again in the 70s and the 80s, and obviously it's not as if it disappeared entirely between those times. But you think about the 50s, you think about McCarthyism, you think about the witch hunts. You also think about the Cold War really flaring up. In some ways, all the way to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you think about the 80s then, and that late flare up of the Cold War, and again that movies like The Day After and Threads and such, which seem to promise, it's coming. Nuclear annihilation is coming, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And I think that horror. Does horror serve like an immediate purpose? Like, you read, say, McCammon's Swan Song, and you're like, well, I don't have to worry about nuclear apocalypse now. There may at least be, I mean, I think there may be an extent to which sometimes when you read things like that, you are experiencing a little bit of, projection, I guess, like you want to see the worst that can happen, and sometimes horror gives you that. I also think though that horror, part of the comfort that it gives, that it's always given, is the comfort that any narrative gives. The narrative tells us the world makes sense. Narrative tells us that the world operates in a sort of recognizable and an understandable fashion. That we may have conflicts, but we can overcome them. And so I think that I think that has had a place before, and I think it probably has a place now. I mean, things seem a little bit different because of social media, and we're exposed. Sometimes it can feel as if as if the computer terminal is the screen is like an exposed nerve. It's just raw or something like that. And but I think that I'm not sure in a way it probably is different in some way. I'm just not sure of the difference. I'm sort of thinking a little bit out loud, because I'm thinking, I can remember when I was a kid thinking, oh my God. I lived in upstate New York, and I thought, I'm safe from your Russian bombs. And then I found out that like IBM's largest microchip facility was like down the road from my house. And that meant that we were a military target too.
Oh, wow.
So, say goodbye, And so, I can remember spending a lot of time. Now, granted, I didn't have the internet to reinforce that. I also didn't have the internet to distract me from that, though, So I mean, it was as if I could just go on and be like, I'm going to look at cute cat videos. It was, no, you're going to sit here and think about this,
Sure.
And so I think that I think that those kinds of anxieties that we have now, and I share them, are every age has its own anxiety, maybe that's suited to or part of its terrain, its topography.
Sure.
And I think that horror, to a certain extent, is going to reflect some of that. To be sure, I also think it offers. Thomas Ligotti, of all people, once said that horror fiction, the consolation that horror fiction gives you when you read it and you're like, yeah, vampires or werewolves or whatever, is that there's somebody else out there who feels the same way you do, who likes the same things you do. And that's actually no small thing. That
sure.
sense of connection that you get. So,
and a lot of creators build that into their works, right? That's why you have the Losers Club and the Lost Boys and all that. I mean,
oh yeah, absolutely.
It's people syncing up with what they're passionate about, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that even if when you get Ligotti say it is most pessimistic or whatever, there's a certain kind of pleasure that you take in the execution of the work, and you're like, wow, that was really depressing. But look at how well he did that. I can remember the first time. I saw watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's horrifying and it's exhilarating. Like
sure,
the end, Leatherface is out there and the girl has gotten away and he's swinging his chainsaw around. This is a remarkable ending, and it's just, you've been taken beyond, you've been taken someplace else.
Sure.
And there's an exhilaration in that. There's horror and absolutely, but I don't know, it's like this kind of negative sublime opens up. And I think that, I think that may be part of the consolation of horror fiction or something like that, and film for that matter too.
Sure.
Is that it gives you access to a sensibility that is not unlike your own.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is, like you said, screen with exposed nerve, and it made me think of Videodrome. And
oh yeah.
And that's not, I was not soothed after watching Videodrome, in any way. But now that you're saying it and thinking out loud about it, you're right. The excellence of how something's executed is its own consolation, right? And I'm
absolutely.
just grateful that anyone's willing to go that far, but in a smart, not exploitative way, like they're actually trying to have a point, right? So
that's absolutely Cronenberg. I remember watching his remake of The Fly. And just holy cow, like you just every time you think he's gone as far as he's going to get, going to go, he goes even further, and you're just like, David, stop, and right up to the very end, which is just is awful,
sure.
And yet there is this weird kind of joy. There was for me anyway, this weird kind of joy in the kind of integrity of the guy's vision, that he doesn't give you the happy ending, that he sticks to his guns. There was something that was really kind of refreshing about that. And I think that, sometimes, I think there are certainly horror narratives that give you the consolation of the happy ending. And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. Some horror films perform and horror novels perform in a very conservative kind of way. There's the monster shows up, the monster is defeated, everybody's happy. That's okay. Sometimes we need that. But I also think that the a narrative like The Fly that says, no, man, this is all messed up. Everybody's going to be just forever messed up after this thing. I think that's okay too. I think that has its sort of self-consistency or something like that.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because that's the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because we push some boundaries on our social media for our podcast, just because we're really curious people and we like to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes it gets us in trouble because we'll ask a question like, what's the best horror movie of this year or whatever? And I notice that there's a certain amount of blowback inevitably every time we do it, and the response is always, why did you pick that? That's not a horror movie. And it's the most the most boring argument in the world to me, right? Because I would rather be asked, why do you think that's a horror movie, than told that's not a horror movie, as if there's some kind of ultimate arbiter of what's a horror movie.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But how do you feel about genre boundaries in horror fiction? Do you feel like there are things where if someone came to you and said, Blood Meridian's a horror novel, you'd be like, that's ridiculous? Or do you have what's the scope of this genre boundary to you?
Well, I try to be very Catholic about it in the sense that I try to take the sort of the big tent view or whatever. And yeah, part of that comes out of having grown up in the 80s, really, as a horror reader. And I remember getting my copy of Stephen King's Danse Macabre. And at the end of that book, he's got a list of like 100 recommended horror novels.
I love that list.
And and it's all over the place. Thomas Pynchon's V is on there. And and I can remember somebody brought this up to someone like M. John Harrison or whatever. And Harrison was like, what a limiting way to, what a poor way to think of V. And I thought, no, man, you're missing the point. That it's saying, this is how capacious this horror thing is.
Exactly.
Here's the thing. Look, you can absolutely say that there is a kind of center of gravity to the horror genre, and you can absolutely say, I mean, King makes that argument in Danse Macabre. He's got his archetypes, the ghost, and the thing without a name in that. And so I think you can absolutely make the argument that these things do sit. It's sort of they're the sun or something like that. They have the sort of center of mass. But I think you can also move out from there and still be within the sort of the horror gravitational well or something like that.
That's great. That's a great way to put it.
Doing your own thing. It's again, when I think of science fiction, right, and I'm not a science fiction writer and I haven't read a lot of it for a while, but I think of spaceships and I think of robots and I think of laser guns and all this kind of stuff, right?
Sure.
But there are science fiction stories that are much more subtle than that, which might sit very far out from that center of mass, and yet which still deserve or still qualify, I guess you would say, as science fiction. So
sure,
I like, for myself as a writer, I find genre really interesting because I think of it as a kind of formal device that allows you ways to structure your stories. So I love it when somebody says to me, "I'm doing an anthology of giant squid stories." And my first thought is always, that's a horrible idea, But then my second thought is, giant squid. Do you know any giant squid stories? There's that giant squid in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Mm-hmm. Are there other giant squids? What happens in a giant squid story? and so it what I start to think about then is the sort of the narrative form that these things tend to fit in, and I see that as the kind of narrative equivalent of a sonnet. When you sit down to write a sonnet, it's 14 lines long. It's got to be, about 10 syllables a line, octave and sextet,
sure,
and all this kind of stuff. And so I see it then the same way that a poet who sits down to write a sonnet might say, I'm just going to write a normal sonnet. Or the poet might say, you know what, I'm going to flip it upside down. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Mm-hmm. So I look at the genre conventions then in the same way. I want to write a vampire story. I mean, man, you could do nothing but write vampire stories, and you would never exhaust the conventions. You would never get done playing with the conventions.
Sure.
That's Stephen Graham Jones is another writer I should have mentioned that is sort of part of our little group of friends, and Stephen. With Mongrels, but even before that, he's done this with Demon Theory, a series of books about sort of playing on demonic possession stories, and he's played with serial killer stories and sort of zombie stories, and he's forever doing that. He's forever just in his stories and in his novels, he's forever just taking the conventions and saying, that's interesting. What if you did this? Oh, that's interesting. What if you did that?
You got to know the rules before you break them. That's
and
exactly. It might actually not be the same person. So, but I remember in the midst of time way back, my mind was blown by a book called it was called Horror 100 Best Books.
Absolutely.
Is that Stephen Jones?
Stephen Jones, and he did. It's funny. I just ordered about a couple of weeks ago. He did a sequel called Horror, Another 100 Best
I
Books,
saw it,
and I just picked that up a couple of weeks ago.
And I was so impressed by how it was put together and how thoughtful their choices were. And it blew my mind when you open it up and it starts with like Shakespeare, and then that's how I discovered The Black Spider. And then I would have never I probably wouldn't have read Wasp Factory without. But that's why I feel like it's frustrating to me, because I feel like people are robbing themselves of the experience by walling off the genre that they love and saying, that's not in it. So, I'm not interested, but I can't imagine anything more horrifying than Wasp Factory. Right. No, that is a messed up book, man. I mean, I've taught that a couple of times. I had the chance years ago to have a conversation with Ian Banks. He was a lovely man. But there was some dark stuff going on in that guy's head. I mean, it was, it's a great book. It's such a disturbing book, and it riffs. There are ways in which it riffs on the Frankenstein story. Mm-hmm. The protagonist's name is Frank and has been made into a certain. Anyway, it's a crazy book. Yeah, for sure. Which of your characters out of all of them, in any story or book, whatever, would you most want to have a beer with, if any?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I write about some rotten people.
I know.
Yeah, I think I would want to avoid as many of them as I because either they're rotten people or I've done terrible things to them as a writer, right?
Oh,
I'm sitting down across the table from them and they're like, "You son of a," it's it's an interesting question. I mean. And in some of the, it's sort of funny. In some of the more recent stories that I've written, they're much more sort of playing with autobiography, and it's my younger self or what have you. And I sometimes think, I wonder about that. What it would be like to have a soda with your 14-year-old self, and if you could. How would you see yourself, and how could you maybe reassure yourself from some of your anxieties and that sort of stuff. I have a bunch of like wizards and sort of sorcerers in the stories and books but they make me nervous. So I think, because you say the wrong thing, you make them mad and then forget it. You're a toad or something like that. So
all the people in your universe are to be avoided. You're doing a good job.
No, I think so. I have a pretty decent kid and a young man in a story called Shadow and Thirst that appeared in Chris Golden's Seize the Night vampire anthology. The protagonist in that story is a pretty decent guy, so he would probably be okay. He'd probably be safe to have a beard.
I'd probably have a beard with Howard from Fisherman. He seems to be able to tell a hell of a story.
I don't know about Howard. I am not, I'm not sure about him. I've thought, he may show up in a later story. I don't know. He may know other things.
Oh, cool.
He may have heard other things, I think.
That's awesome. This has been great. It's so much fun to talk to you. I really appreciate you. What's the best way for people to learn about you and your work and find you online and elsewhere?
They can. I have a blog at WordPress that I'm on intermittently. It's just Mr. Gaunt or they. What is it? Mr. Gaunt, the website for John Langan, horror writer or something like that. But if they type in my name, there's another John Langan who writes a bunch of composition textbooks. I am not that John Langan. I can't tell. I've gotten several letters. The late great Michael Shea wrote me a letter. He published a story called The Growlim. It was this brilliant story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And I had written to Gordon Van Gelder and I said, hey, that's a great story. And Michael wrote me this note saying, "Oh, Mr. Langan, thank you, and I've loved you. I've used your books in my composition classes." Oh, sorry, but so it's I'm not that guy. But if you look for horror writer, you'll find me. And the webpage is good. I'm around on Facebook and Twitter far more than I should be. So those are good too.
Awesome, and I'll link to all that in the show notes. This has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
And I can't recommend The Fisherman enough. This is one terrifying, strangely consoling piece of work. So
thank you so much.
You're very welcome.